Thank you so much, Linda. I can't tell you how happy I am to see you, not only because you're a Connecticut College mother, but because you've taken such extraordinary leadership roles in this great city. Thank you also, all of you, who have stepped forward to work on the Women's Initiative, because in fact, I guess David took my notes back. That's okay, I can wing it, I think. You'll see, I won't look at them, but they make me feel secure. I was doing algebra, that's not good. Anyway, what I want to say is that the Women's Initiative, particularly here in this city, follows a tradition that is 228 years old. So, if somebody asks you, who's your mama? I'm going to tell you this morning, who's your mama? Because in fact, right after the founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then crafted the Constitution in 1787, and then got to work creating a nation, this is crazy, you won't believe it, but a nation based on a creed instead of a nation based on the power of victory. I know it's crazy, but it actually happened. People sat down and said to each other, what would it look like if we decided to found a nation state built on a set of ideas? Instead of, we own this land, and we're going to wipe you out, and you're going to try to, and then the war, and then whoever wins. That's a whole different approach. And many countries that our ancestors came from were founded in that old way. So it's been working. In fact, it's been working all over the world. But the reason that democracy, this crazy idea, has actually flourished in the global setting in the last 50 years is because of a nation founded on a creed. This one. The United Nations document that declares the rights of man, human rights, is based on our Declaration of Independence. That's pretty wild. The ideas that framed America are what are framing the rest of the world now. And you're hearing me say ideas, and not just the economy, or in fact, our spectacular military. So you might say, I know all of that stuff. Tell me something I don't know. Well, you know one other thing. You know that as soon as the Declaration and the Constitution were written, the country was committed in its documents to enabling commerce to grow. Why? Well, because the United States was the littlest and least powerful country in the world with Europeans in it. And it didn't have sewer systems in its cities like Paris had had since the 1200s. It didn't have any universities of great moment. It had some nice colleges in Boston, and that was great, and even one in a city named New Haven, but nothing like the universities in Europe, which had been founded in the 1200s. There were like 86 major universities, Bologna, and so what were the founders worried about? A second invasion from very powerful nations that could win this time. The crazy Revolutionary War, you know, that was a mistake. England lost by mistake. They would just come back and fix that. So in the Constitution, there's a piece that talks about patent law, so that, in fact, the freedom to create energetic commerce and grow an economy that could grow the power to stave off the power of the great nation states that had, after all, circumnavigated the globe, settled all, okay, you know all that. You probably think that that's it. But what I want to tell you is that while the Industrial Revolution was happening, subsequent to those documents, and you know that history, the Reaper and the Transcontinental Railroad, America, as we know it, at the cultural and human level, was being founded by your mother. And that's absolutely true. And those women were black and white. They were rich and poor. They were educated and absolutely uneducated. But they were focused on what it would take to create a nation. And Daughters of the Declaration tells how women created the nation state that we are very powerfully a part of, and a nation state that was completely distinctive from other nation states at the time, and largely still distinctive today for the same reason. Because the creed was the dominant document in the lives of these women. And what the founders did when they decided to try to make a democracy was to say, okay, what are you going to need to make a democracy? It's got to be able to defend itself, all of that doo-wop. But it's got to be able to express the creed. How does that happen? Well, these were all very well-educated men. They knew from Aristotle that democracy cannot endure without virtue in the people. That's bad news. I mean, I realize we all did the best we could with our children, but when you look across the nation, there are a lot of children of mothers. What can I say? They're not acting out of the highest level of virtue. What the founders decided was that they needed to have some true commitment to virtue in the people. And who could make that happen? Well, who were the people that spent the most time with children? Because you'd have to inculcate virtue right away. Answer? Mamas, yes. So there are actual documents that show how women who wanted to vote, and the founders said, you know, that's going to be all messy with politics, and I don't agree with that, but nonetheless, they said to women, the real work that will sustain the republic is if women would take up the transference of virtue to the subsequent generations. And you'll get a much more detailed version of this, but I want to tell you other things. Women took on the role of teaching virtue. Now, of course, men thought that that would mean sitting by the fireside and reading scripture. Men always think things like that, and it's so sweet. What really happened was women did that, but then they got up and walked across the little town square, just like we have here in New Haven, to do an errand or to see a friend. And little by little, very early on, they saw women begging. The same women who are taking their children to the food truck were instead sitting in the square. They'd lost their husbands to an epidemic, the War of 1812, or other nasty altercations, or to nasty bouts in bars. Okay, so they have 6 or 7 little kids and no food. So they sit in the square like this, and the woman with her 3 or 5 little children walks by. She's just read them the 2 greatest commandments. She's just read them the Good Samaritan. Does she walk on by? No. She stops and talks. She's the Good Samaritan, showing her children what virtue means. You can't just talk about virtue. You have to do virtue and be virtue. So Mama realizes, along with other mamas, what's going on. And by 1815, there were more than 100 solutions to the women in the park with children with no food. Not a food truck, but women got together with each other and they made little societies just like the Women's Initiative. And they said, what should we do? And very low-income women in more poor communities said, we'll bring a penny a week from our domestic budgets, and we'll gather up our money, and over time, we'll just make sure that widows have what they need from our larders or from our little kitty, and we'll take care of each other until they can get on their feet. There's a great story of, I can't tell it this morning because of time, but there's a great story of how they set up actual homes where there would be 4 or 5 widows and children who would live in the home. There'd be a workroom and a playroom for children, and the women whose families were intact would babysit and would also provide the workroom with looms and spinning wheels and all of that stuff so that the widows could work and the other women would sell what they made and give the money to the widows to support the house and their children and help them to be productive but be with their children. A solution a mother could love, right? All those children were learning virtue. They were learning independence, self-discipline, self-reliance, compassion, generosity. That's a heck of a scripture right there. And it reinforced what they were reading in scripture. But the scripture by itself, frankly, nobody hears me, wouldn't have been enough. No, it's got to be followed through. So women started little societies. And when Tocqueville walked through the country, what did he notice? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds by 1830 of little societies doing the work of the country. And he was surprised. He was so surprised he didn't notice that they were, from a pragmatic standpoint, all little women's societies. And those societies were transmitting the importance of productivity and independence and self-reliance, all of those virtues, in everyday life on a constant basis. It stopped kids from being rich kids raised in rich families and poor kids raised someplace else who knows how, because the mothers were bringing them together, because they were all minding children. One of the greatest changes that happened in this nation that's least known is the rise of women's societies. It transformed the whole 19th century and created the nonprofit, which David and I say, social profit sector in the United States of America. We are the only country in the world that had an indigenous growth of this kind of society at the family and community level. And it moved on a surge-up basis to frame our culture. And when some people, first women, got a lot of money, they set up foundations. The first foundations were set up by women, not Rockefeller and Carnegie, blessed men. But the first all-purpose foundations were set up by women, by Olivia Sage. And the first thing she did was a massive study of poverty in one city, in Pittsburgh, because now there were lots and lots of organizations, not as many as today, but lots. And she said, but do we really understand what's going on with the poor? Answer, no. How the heck would you find out? Door to door? So guess who she hired? Dozens and dozens of women, most of whom were the first graduates of women's colleges. And they went out door to door in the Pittsburgh tenements and did surveys. It was the first time we had a study of what poverty looked like. Then people could figure out how to address that in a structured way with money that was dedicated to an outcome. So anytime we think we've invented any of this stuff, take a deep breath and try to do it as well as your mama. Because those are the mamas of all of us. Now I want to take you back to 1792, to a black woman who had been a slave, an enslaved woman, separated from her mother at age 6 and held by a master who never recognized her giftedness. She kept trying to prevail on him to let her go, and finally, with money that she had earned on the side and the help of a white woman, Isabel Graham, Catherine Ferguson bought her freedom, paid Graham back over time, and set up her own little space and continued to work her whole life. Catherine is a true sister to all of us. Catherine realized that little children of the poor were working 6-day weeks, 12 hours a day. No school for these children at all. How would they ever improve their lot in life? Answer, they wouldn't. That's how we make sure there are more poor people every year. Catherine said, nothing doing. The only day children are free is Sunday. So she said, I'm going to raise the money. She had a big idea. Poor children should work. Okay, they had to work. But poor children should be taught to read so that eventually they could be apprenticed to a job that would move them out of that class of people working that way and into a different lifestyle. So Catherine took up her after work time baking wedding cakes, which she was spectacular at, sold them, and every week she collected a kitty until she started a school on Sunday. Now, I know this is going to shock some of you. It was not a Sunday school the way we understand it, where only religion was taught. This was a school to teach children to read. Catherine's money bought books and paid people in the community who could read to come in and tutor. Catherine had a radical idea. She thought it would be fine, this is the part that will shock you, if black and white poor children learned to read in the same place. How's that for a radical person? She brought them together, and in her own digs, there was the first Sunday school. Well, of course, these kids did so well in the first 8 to 10 years that this organization was up and running, that a bunch of the Methodist churches decided they would start a Sunday school, and that the people in the parish would contribute. And that idea spread all through the city of New York and all through the states, that poor children should have a chance to get educated. So the idea of open education, particularly for the poor, is an idea given to all of us by this brilliant black woman who lived to be 84, raised 41 foster children, half black, or half of them were black and half were white. She was a woman of the 21st century. Most of you, and I, have never heard her name. That's crazy. She holds the same ideas that we are holding on high today. And there she was with no resources, a very difficult childhood, and a very hard time getting free to do what she believed God was calling her to do. Women started entrepreneurship, and Catherine is a perfect example. And I don't want you to think that Daughters of the Declaration is about benevolent, good women. It is, but that's not all. This is a book about women entrepreneurs. The women in this book were not only good, benevolent women, but they were hard-nosed business women. Their business was transforming the social sector so that it would be a place that could be highly productive on behalf of the democracy and the economy. So what do I mean? Well, if you talk to Michael Porter at Harvard, and don't try because it's extremely hard to get hold of him. I've done it. Only succeeded once out of numerous efforts. An entrepreneur is someone who is a value creator, takes this situation and makes it into this situation. You'd think you'd need power and money and independence and all that. Answer is no. Porter says, and James, Jim Collins, and Porras have this wonderful book in which they describe, along with Porter, what it means to be an entrepreneur. The first thing you have to have is a BHAG, which means a big, hairy, audacious goal, right? A big, hairy, audacious goal. And that would be black and white children at the poorest level in our society are going to learn to read, and they're going to learn to read together because a bunch of us as citizens are going to make that happen. To which everyone would say, you gotta be kidding me. A BHAG is 75% of our children in the schools don't get access to food in the summer. We're going to create a solution to that, a food truck. Oh my God, she's got another idea. Could someone give her 2 martinis and hope she sleeps and forgets this? That's a BHAG where everyone else. Okay, so Catherine had a BHAG. And then an entrepreneur doesn't just take a nap and hopes it passes. An entrepreneur says, what the heck would I have to do to make that happen? Clink, clink, clink. 3 or 4 or whatever it is, strategies to get it to happen. Then there are tactics under each strategy. Smaller activities that you have to do to get that strategy to make itself evident. And then you have to do something almost everyone in this room knows about and has done. And that is, you have to raise capital. Does this sound like any old commercial entity? You have a big idea, we need a new hardware store, or we need a new, kind of computer. We need these little things we can make calls on in our hand instead of with a wire. You ever watch Perry Mason and you see everybody using these things with curly wires? You say, what are those? Anyway, so you have a BHAG. You've got the strategies and tactics, then you've got to raise the capital to make the thing work. Well, Catherine raised the capital by making more wedding cakes. Women invented fundraising. Read my lips. The first letter campaign started by a woman during the Revolutionary War, to spread the idea that women, wealthy and poor, ought to join the soldiers in trying to found the nation independent of England. And she had her friends go door to door to collect money to send to General Washington. Great story. Esther DeBert Reed. Gotta read that story. She's amazing. The first woman who raised big money, besides door-to-door and also, that is, door-to-door calling and letter campaign, which Esther did. The first woman who raised major community money was Maria Chapman, who was a wildly committed abolitionist in 1830 in Boston. You know what she did? She invented the idea of a fundraising fair and auction. Never heard of that, right? She was so successful, and the idea of raising money like that was so powerful that people all over the country caught on, because women wrote each other letters and said, you won't believe what Maria did this month. She wrote to her friends in France, and they sent Limoges pottery, china, and we auctioned it off. You would not believe the price. And of course, women would go to the fair ahead of time and see what was wonderful, and then they'd tell their husbands what they wanted for Christmas. And the women who were selling and trying to raise money would put atrocious prices on it, and, the husbands would buy it. And they raised huge amounts of money to change the views of Northerners about slavery. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just that the people in the North were smarter or better than Southerners, or that our economy wasn't so dependent on slavery. People worked to abolitionize. That's what the women who worked with Maria Chapman said. She abolitionizes us. because she's got this crazy idea that the democracy cannot perdure in the presence of slavery. Again, we don't understand what radical ideas these were. But there was the BHAG, and then the strategies. She published books. You'll love Maria. You'll love the nuns. Some of you read the book, told me you enjoyed reading about Mother Seton and Mother Elizabeth Lang, a Haitian woman, a black Haitian, who came to this country and founded a religious order committed to teaching the poor and making sure that poor children were appropriately cared for if they became orphans, that they had appropriate care. Both of these women, Sisters of Charity and the Oblates of Divine Providence, both orders have supported the development of millions and millions of people in our country, have given us the upward mobility we've needed to create the strength in the economy, the strength in the democracy. But they did it with a BHAG, what they wanted to see happen in the world. And then how it was going to happen. Well, they'd have to have a team of women like themselves who were going to devote full energy and go wherever they were needed. And believe me, cities would call up Mother Lang and say, could you bring a group of your nuns and start a this or that, or help us cope with such and such. So the nuns were the BHAG of the mayors. When the nuns got there, they knew exactly what they had to do. And one of the first things they did was start women's alliances for their work. And they raised capital. And they bought buildings. And they invested the capital before they had to pay it out in banks, and they understood compound interest. This was before women could own property, before women could inherit property. Everything financial that happened to a woman went to her husband. Well, the nuns, the women who wanted to do it on their own, said, I'm going to start a religious order. And Mother Lang was afraid that bishops in this country, white and maybe narrow-minded, wouldn't go for a black order. So she got her apostolic letter that she needed to start the order from the Pope. And when the bishop did try to get after her and tell her why didn't they drop the habits and become domestics in the rectories for priests, she took out her letter and said, you know, this order is sanctioned by the Vatican, therefore we're not doing that and you can't make us. And she won. I want to tell some of my friends, the nuns who are having trouble with, never mind. No, but I mean, these were radical people who were doing real life things. They were coping with what we're coping with without technology, without the kind of health care we have as women. But they were having the same physical problems. There wasn't another chassis back then. It was the same old stuff. But they didn't have the interventions we have. And yet, they were committed to making this nation make good on the words in that Declaration of Independence. Now, there are a bunch of women I haven't told you about in the late 19th century who assured that this great country that was still, in 1880, employing 6-year-olds and older children, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Women stopped child labor. And it was a terrible fight. And when you read it, you know, the good thing about reading this history is then you pick up the New York Times and you say, no problem. No, I'm serious. Because we can think that what we're living with is the, oh my God, you know, can you believe that? But that's just because we don't know the history. And we're not looking at it from the standpoint of families who have to cope on a daily basis with, this is what we're living with, this is what the documents say. How does that work? First of all, how many of us worry about that? You get up in the morning and say, you know what, that document says all men are created equal. It doesn't say some men have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I know damn well it isn't all yet. So what am I doing about that? Maybe it's I'm making a certain number of checks, and I'm raising nice children, and I live in a lovely community, and I show up for. And I would say to you, read what the women in our past did. Read what Mary McLeod Bethune did. Unbelievable stuff. Because they let their imaginations for goodness run wild, as you are doing in the Women's Initiative. But don't dream small, because you're part of an awesome tradition that has given this nation its most exceptional characteristic. And that is a characteristic of citizen generosity. People who understand that we're not generous as Americans because we're rich. It's just not true that all the people in this room are rich. All the people in this room are generous because you understand that in America, we're not generous because we're rich. We're rich because we've been generous. But I would beg you to hold that thought in your minds. And then generosity with your time. If you're at our stage where we're making out wills, you've got to bequest to United Way and maybe to the Women's Initiative in United Way, so that you know that if anything happens to you, this work is going on, because you'll always be a mother in this community, whether or not you're a physical mother. We, as women, are mothers of this democracy. We are responsible to make the words in the Declaration actual experience for every other person in the country. Social justice doesn't just happen, it is the work of each of us. And these women show us how complicated, how hard, and how successful this work can be. So it kind of doesn't leave us any room to sit back. But when you read what the women in the settlement houses in the 1880s did to take in millions of immigrants and prepare them to understand American work habits, to speak English, to have access in the settlement houses, not just to bathing facilities for sanitation and public health, but art galleries, and teaching music to children in the basement rooms. These were women who understood that they were always part of raising other people's children, just as the Women's Initiative is. So I could talk to you about the book for several hours, but I want you to be free by 9 o'clock, and I want to be sure we have time for questions. And so I want to tell you that I am deeply grateful to Linda and to Jack and to United Way for the opportunity to be here. I'm also spectacularly grateful to David Burnett, who's here, who's my co-author and my husband of 44 years. So David, it's embarrassing how much fun we had writing this book together, and I'm going to ask him to join me for a short Q&A. Because we really shared all of the research of this and just coming into each other's offices and saying, would you believe what I found out about Catherine? Or did you know that, I read all this stuff about Elizabeth Lang, but I didn't, the women whose BHAG was to stop drunkenness, and what they did to change the nation. It wasn't just getting the vote. I think that's what most of us have been told. But we would just burst into each other's offices with a, you won't believe this. So I'm very grateful to all of you. And I would say to you, almost every morning, you should think about the words in the Declaration. The words you know well are, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know that. But maybe you don't know the last lines. And the last lines say, in order to achieve all of this stuff, in the earlier parts of the document, with the help of divine providence, we pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That's the pledge all of us take, rich and poor, if we want to have access to those rights. That's who you are as citizens, and you certainly know what you're doing in this great initiative in New Haven. So thank you, and God bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So did I exaggerate that you were in for a treat this morning? I can't help, as I listen to Claire speak so passionately, so knowledgeably, I'm reminded of the fact that we all are here and we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us. I'm ever so often reminded of that, and I'm reminded of it this morning. And so, again, let's think of the people who are coming after us and make our community a better place so that they can stand on our shoulders.
Here, here.
And thank you so much. Thank you, thank you.
A couple of questions. Does anyone have a question? Lots to think about, right? Over here.
Why don't I bring the mic over? First, thank you. Very inspirational. My question to you is what inspired you? So if you step back before you wrote the book, kind of what got you there? Was it a person or was it something that was just in your background?
Oh, that's such a generous question. Well, as college president, and having been, David and I were both scholarship students at college, I realized that I was working with trustees who taught me about generosity in a whole chunk beyond the generosity I've been taught in my family. And they were largely the women trustees at Connecticut College. So I learned all about that, and when I finished my presidency, I came here to the Yale Law School and spent 3 years writing The Greater Good, which was how it is that philanthropy has actually helped to build the American economy, moving from that idea that we're not generous because we're rich, but rich because of our generosity and all the industries, in fact, that were started initially by a gift. So I began to see philanthropy in a different way beyond benevolence, which again, I don't want to look down on, but it's just the other wing of benevolence is the practical asset to a market economy. The dynamism that comes in when good ideas can get money from a philanthropist before it's clear it's going to have a return on invested funds, when it can create assets within human capital by plucking people from where they are and putting them where they ought to be. A lot of countries, don't do that. So I wrote The Greater Good here, and when I finished writing The Greater Good, I realized in writing the kind of practical history of philanthropy, I'd written about a boatload of women. So then David and I decided, well, maybe we just ought to write that book. What is it? How did the whole sector get started? And so it was really that sort of the trustees were the kind of grandmothers, and then The Greater Good was the mother of daughters. So it was a wonderful kind of a progression, and a great thrill to do it with such a terrific man that I get the privilege to live with.
Another question over here.
Claire, I wonder if you saw a couple of articles about some research done by some universities in California that give us some not quite so rosy picture that the wealthier people become, the less compassionate they seem to be. What is your response to that?
Well, that was disappointing research, and it was going in a particularly disappointing direction because of the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, which I talk about in The Greater Good and the dangers of that. It tells me that we need to have change in communities. And I'm going to say something weird as a woman who's had a very public career as well as, raising with David two pretty terrific children. But I think we've reached a certain point in society where the kind of absolutely non-transcendent secularism has met an asset accumulation that has made people just not think the same way about their relationship to each other. Because the other part of the research that many of you know about is we can pretty much estimate your proportional generosity based on how often you are part of a religious community. And as you know, younger generations are throwing that off and not seeing the usefulness of that. Well, again, whether or not there's a God, don't be mad, because I continue to practice my Catholicism, but whether or not, the idea that you come together to think about the needs of others in a community in a religious framework is very powerful, and it frames how you think about your responsibilities. Probably 98% of the women in the book had a religious orientation, regardless of whether they were gay or straight or black or white or rich or poor. So we're losing some of that in society, and we're seeing the greater accumulation of wealth by a smaller and smaller number. If we can't, as women, right now in America, decide that these trends are not congruent with a democratic past, where the enabling of the words in the Declaration to become real has been a constant effort of everybody over the years, our future doesn't look joyful. And I'm less worried about the economic and even the military transformations going forward than I am worried about these, may I say, spiritual and community transformations. We, as women, were the ones whom the nation's founders turned to when there wasn't any record of how to become a good democracy. Now we know pretty much what it takes. And a lot of us have been gloriously busy with careers, which I'm very much in favor of, but we've got to figure out what the real balancing act. It isn't work and family. It's really the individual and the community in the context of the greater good. I didn't say today, but I would say to you, remember, self-interest rightly understood. That means I understand that it is in my best interest to make sure that you and your children do as well as possible in life. No matter what you look like, no matter who you are, no matter where you came from, no matter what your educational health, whatever, it's in my best interest, that you do as well as possible. In a democracy, I know that you will have that same citizen inspiration toward me. And when you multiply all of that, you get this rich, thick, dynamic community. And that is where, as David's reminding me, social capital is nested. And economic capital arises out of that social capital. And we've got great opportunities now. We've got to make them happen as women, like those women did 230 years ago. Is it doable? Absolutely. But we have to be willing to say, I understand the problem, and I understand that women are going to be the point of the spear in getting the breakthrough to happen. Otherwise, we'll just keep muddling through. The founders said in text that very often, with ample opportunities to create wealth, some men, now this is by men, not me, some men will have a tendency to become dangerously avaricious and greedy. Now, I know none of us know anyone like this. We've never read about anyone like this. But it is possible. And the notion of building virtue was to create a counterbalance to that problem. So wealth is wonderful, but it's got to be connected to the virtue of generosity and self-interest, rightly understood. So with all that we've done as women, we've got to become better preachers. Whatever your religion or non-religion is, we've got to believe in the greater good and in self-interest, rightly understood. Or our grandchildren will not have our country, our democracy available to them.
Thank you, Claire and David, for bringing these fascinating stories of women throughout history to life. We are committed to getting you out of here on time. We appreciate you waking up early with us today. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Diane Turner, our board chair, Leadership Council member, philanthropist, talented leader, and in her free time, she's the Associate Librarian for Human Resources and Organizational Development at Yale University, and she'll give us the closing remarks.
Thank you. I'm certainly not going to keep you. Claire, David, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to your books. They're on sale in the back. By all means, stop and get one and read it. Read it from cover to cover. You've been just a wonderful audience. We think that you've been so sweet, so we ask you to take the sweets that's on the table, share it with others if you'd like. I'd like for just the United Way staff to stand, who've just awesome group of folks who really understand the common good and the importance of doing that. So please, thank you so much. And the board of directors, those members who are here, please stand. Those on the board of United Way. And finally, a huge, huge thank you to Marie, Linda, Jack, for leading this initiative. Outstanding. We hope that you will become a part of this initiative. I also call it this movement because there is so much to be done. The truck is just the beginning. The number of children that we fed last summer is just phenomenal. We can do more this summer. So please join this movement. Ask us about this pen. Become involved with us. Thank you again for coming and look forward to hearing more from you. Good night.